Welcome to the Berean Voice. I'm Randy Seaver. Today we're going to be looking again at John chapter 3 and verse 16. I have been debating about whether to try to answer some of the comments that were made on our last video first or to continue with our study. And I think I'm going to do my best to try to get through this material that we've been looking at. And then if we have time at the end of this particular video, we'll try to address some of those comments. But if not, we'll try to do another brief video and talk about those just a little bit. I want to say I appreciate the fact that some of you have commented, and I want to encourage others of you to comment. I do want you, when you comment, rather than saying you believe such and such, or you don't understand such and such, if you would couch that in a different way, it would be helpful. If you would say to me, are you saying that? Okay, I want you to find out what I believe before you begin to address what you think I believe. Because what you think I believe and what I actually do believe may be two separate and distinct things. So when you make your comments, don't impute to me something that I don't believe, or assume that I don't have some understanding that you think I need to have, and it would be helpful if you would do it that way. I'm going to try to be as kind to people who comment as I possibly can. Now, mind you, I'm an old man, and old men tend to get crusty, and sometimes old men tend to lose their memory. There are going to be, as I'm making these videos, there are going to be some Biden moments. I hope I'm not going to drool on my shirt the way the president does. But you will understand that I'm not a young man any longer, and sometimes my brain ceases to function. Every time I hear James White whining because he's turned 60 and now he's so old, I think, son, you don't know anything yet. You just wait. When you get to be my age, you're going to understand some things that you don't have a clue about yet. 60 was easy compared to my age. So please forgive me if sometimes I just can't come up with what I need to say. One of my problems through the years is I've never, since I was a very young pastor, haven't used notes. I have depended on my memory. And God has blessed me with a good memory. One of the things I found that as I studied through a biblical passage, by the time I finished exegeting the passage, I had, without trying, committed that passage to memory. That's nice as long as you're young, but when you get to be old, that begins to fail you, and sometimes you look like a real Doomkopf. So please forgive me if I don't quite come up with what I want to say in the process of these videos, and I appreciate your patience. Okay, let's go back and just recap what we've looked at thus far. We've seen that in looking at John chapter 3 and verse 16, it is just not an automatic given that the word cosmos must mean every single person on the face of the earth. In fact, as we search the scriptures, and that's what I invite you to do, I don't want you to take my word for anything. If you haven't learned this yet, please learn it, and that is that people can post most anything on YouTube, and it may have nothing whatsoever to do with truth. And so I really don't want you to take my word for anything I say. I want you to search the scriptures to see if these things are so. Okay, so I'm just giving you suggestions. The homework is yours. And so what I've asked people to do is show me something in the context of John chapter 3 and verse 16 that would demand, not that just would allow, but that would demand that you understand the word cosmos to mean every single person on the face of the planet, and that God loved everyone equally and in the same way, and he sent his son to die so that no one would perish, and he's really doing the best he can to get people to hear that message and respond to it, because nothing Jesus did can be effective unless you add your free will decision to it. You show me something in the context. And let me remind you that when we talk about context, we're talking about literary context, we're talking about historical context, theological context, we're talking about cultural context. What was being discussed during the first century? What was the burning question? Was it for how many did Jesus die? Was it how many people did God love? And the answer is absolutely not. The question during the first century was this: are the Gentiles accepted into the kingdom on the same basis as the Jews? Or must you be circumcised and keep the law of Moses? That's what the first church council was about. That's what much of the New Testament literature was about. Read through the book of Galatians, read through the book of Romans, and you're going to find these things set forth very clearly. Often people get mixed up about what books like Galatians are talking about, and they want to use proof text out of it because they don't understand what the primary thrust of the book is all about. They think it's about justification and whether or not you're regenerated before faith, or you have faith before you're regenerated, and they want to come up with these proof texts, and the texts don't have anything to do with that. And we're going to look at some of those texts if time permits before I croak. I keep remembering that line from one of the songwriters that said, a few more rolling suns at most will land me on fair Canaan's coast, where I shall sing the songs of grace and see my blessed hiding place. I'm keenly aware of the fact that I don't have too much more time, and so who knows if I'll get through all the verses that I've proposed that I want to get through. But we're going to keep plugging, Lord willing, and try to get through some of them. But my challenge to you is, look at the context, literary, historical, cultural, theological, and tell me something that demands that you understand this word cosmos to mean every single person without exception. Now, these are some of the meanings of the word, some of the usages of the word. And keep in mind, words don't have meaning apart from usage. And if you're going to define words, you don't go to an English dictionary to do it. You look at how it is used in the literature of the time. I made the comment on the last video that in John chapter 1, there's one verse in which the word cosmos is used 3 different times, and in none of those does it mean every single person without exception. And my wife, who is quite astute, said to me, wait a second, if the second of those has to do with creating the entire universe, including its inhabitants, does that not mean that it includes every single person without exception? Now, what I've found is that my wife is sharp enough that if she doesn't understand what I've said, it probably isn't her understanding, it's my explanation that's the problem. So let me explain what I mean when I say that particular usage doesn't mean every single person without exception. What I mean is it does not mean every person without exception exclusively. It's talking also about the stars and the moon and the sun, the planets. It's talking about the hills. It's talking about the trees. It's talking about the fish. It's talking about the water the fish swim in. And it's unlikely that any of those can be plugged into John chapter 3 and verse 16, unless we are thinking in terms of cosmic redemption. And it is true, isn't it, that Jesus did not simply die to save a people for himself, but he died in order to redeem the cosmos. He died in order to release the cosmos from the bondage of corruption, according to Romans chapter 8. And so I hope that helps to clarify what I was saying. I'm saying it does not refer exclusively to people. It refers to all of the universe and everything that God has created. And it's highly unlikely that John chapter 3 and verse 16 means, for God so loved the universe that he gave his Son to redeem it. I think that's probably outside this context, even though you might find it in some other context. And so let's just talk about the different ways. There are 8 at least. It talks about the inhabited earth, the ordered system of the universe, including its inhabitants, a large portion of the population in any given locality, Gentiles in contrast to Hebrews, the ungodly who have set themselves against God and his truth, the people of every nation in contrast to the covenant people of God alone, mankind in general, and the world system characterized by the spirit of the age. Now, if you want to insist that world must mean every single person without exception, I want you to show something in the context, the historical, theological, cultural, literary context that demands that you understand the word in that way. even though that the word cosmos is almost never, if ever, used in that way in the New Testament scriptures. Usually it has some other meaning. Now, I don't want you to take my word for that. I want you to go search for it. Okay? That's your homework. Additionally, we saw that the word loved can have three different meanings. It can refer to the love of God benevolently, it can refer to the love of God beneficently, and it can refer to the love of God, God's complacency, that is, his delight in the object of his love. It is that same love with which he loves his Son. He loves his chosen people in that way because he contemplates them in union with Christ. And so we have to ask the question, in which of these senses is John speaking when he said God loved the world? Now the thing is, we can put different combinations of words together. We can talk about loved and world together in different senses. We can talk about God's love of benevolence toward his creatures generally. Is that reality? Yes. And I could name any number of combinations that we could use to understand this. And this is why I am suggesting that it is illegitimate to use John 3:16 as a proof text against the idea that God has chosen a people for himself and will certainly bring those people to glory, because of the ambiguity in the word world and in the word loved. We don't know exactly in which sense or senses these words were being used. It could be that John was using the word world in 2 or 3 different senses in what he said, because both he and Jesus used deliberate ambiguity in their statements. And so we want to try to find out, in what sense or senses did God love the world? And with what kind of love did God love the world? Is it simply that God is kindly and mercifully disposed to his creatures? Or is it that God opens his hand and satisfies the desire of every living thing and loved in that sense? Or is it talking about God's loving his creation in the same way, that is, every single individual on the face of the earth, in the same way, with great delight that he delights in his Son? You see, this is why this is a difficult passage, and this is also why it is illegitimate to try to use this unclear passage to interpret clear passages. That's one of the rules of interpretation that we must always follow, and that is that obscure passages are always to be interpreted in the light of clear passages. But there's enough ambiguity in this passage to keep us from using this as a proof text. That's the point I'm trying to make. Now, let's just talk a bit about the context, because I think the context gives us some clue about what John or Jesus had in mind in John 3:16. When we go back all the way to chapter 1 of John's Gospel, he begins by saying, "That was the true light, that coming into the world lights every man." Now, in what sense does Jesus, simply by coming into the world, light every single individual, enlighten every single individual on the face of the earth, if every individual on the face of the earth has never heard of him? And the answer is, I think, there is no sense in which he lightens or enlightens every single individual on the face of the earth if every individual has not heard of him. But he's talking here about all without distinction, as opposed to all without exception. John was giving witness to this light. And this is the true light. Now, what does John mean when he says this is the true light, that coming into the world lights every man? Is he saying that all the other lights were false or fake? And the answer is no. He's saying this is the fulfillment of what those types and shadows, for example, the giant menorah in the temple complex, were real lights, but they weren't the true light. Jesus said in the very chapter in which those lights were ignited every evening, John chapter 8, I am the light of the world. I am the fulfillment of that. We go on to the end, the middle of chapter 1, not even to the middle, but he says he came to his own creation, and his own people, Israel, did not receive him. But to as many as received him, who are they? Well, they're believers from among both Jews and Gentiles. As many as received him, to them he gave the authority to become the sons of God, even to them that believe on his name, who were born not of bloods. That is, not by natural generation or by physical birth. How did you get into the kingdom of Israel during the Old Covenant period? And the answer is, you got into the kingdom of Israel either by being born into it or by becoming a proselyte Jew. And John says, you don't get into the spiritual kingdom by being born of bloods. You have to be born from above. And of course, he's anticipating Jesus' conversation with Nicodemus, where Nicodemus came to him by night and said, Master, we know that you're a teacher come from God, because no one can do these miracles that you're doing unless God is with him. And Jesus said, truly, truly, I say to you, you're not even going to get a glimpse of the kingdom unless you're born from above. In other words, you're not going to get into the kingdom, or you're not part of the kingdom, because you have been born physically into it. You are part of the kingdom, or will be part of the kingdom only when God gives you birth from above. In other words, what's being said here in these passages is a new age has dawned. I think it's interesting that Jesus later says, unless a man is born of water and of spirit, he's not going to enter the kingdom. Now, what in the world is he talking about? Is he saying you have to be baptized to be saved? No, that's not what he's saying at all. What he's referring back to, I think, is Ezekiel chapter 36, verses 25 through 27, in which the prophet talks about God washing people with clean water from all their idols and putting his spirit within them. Unless a man be born of water and of spirit, he can't enter the kingdom. In other words, what he's saying here is, look, you're in a different ball game now. Things have changed. No longer are you going to be blessed because you're part of the covenant nation. You must be born from above. You have to be born of water and of spirit. You have to enter into this new arrangement. And keep in mind that even though John was writing about Old Testament events, in other words, anything before the cross was Old Testament, he is now writing on New Covenant ground. And what John is saying throughout all of this is things have changed. And what we have now is far better than anything that went on before. I want you to think about a verse with me. John said the word, this is chapter 1 of John's Gospel, chapter 1 and verse 14. The word became flesh and dwelt among us. The word that is used there for dwelt is the word that means to pitch a tent. I think what John is doing here is he is causing his people, his readers, to think back to the Old Covenant period when God dwelt among his people in the tent of meeting. And he's saying, the Word was made flesh and tabernacled among us. And we beheld his glory. The word beheld there is the word from which we get our word theater. And the idea is we gazed on his glory. We didn't just get a glimpse of it, we gazed on his glory. And I think if you go back to Exodus 33 and 34, and you see where Moses is there requesting that God show him his glory, Yahweh says to him, I'm going to let you see my afterglow, but my full glory you're not going to see. And so Moses got a glimpse of his glory. God declared his glorious attributes as he passed by, and Moses got a glimpse of it. But he could not gaze on it as we now can gaze on the glory of God. In other words, what John is saying here is the new covenant can do for us what the old covenant could never do. We are blessed beyond measure because of the fact that we have now been introduced to a new covenant. Everything has been changed. And as part of that change, people enter the kingdom not as members of the covenant community through physical birth, but people enter that kingdom through spiritual birth, being born from above. And so, when we read in John's Gospel, chapter 3 and verse 16, "For God so loved the world," the likelihood is, what John is saying is, God loved people from every nation, not simply the nation of Israel. Keep in mind, in the cultural context, the theological context of that day, the people of Israel had drummed into them the idea that God loved Israel and would condemn the Gentiles. I think this is why John wrote, "For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved." In other words, he didn't come to condemn the Gentiles as the Jews thought he would, but he came so that people from every nation might have life. It seems to me this is quite clear in this context. But then he goes on. Not only does he say that he dwelt among us, we beheld his glory. The glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. Now, and then he goes on to say, "For the law came by Moses, but grace and truth came by Jesus Christ." Is he saying there that Moses had no truth, or there was no truth found in the Old Covenant Scriptures? And of course the answer is no. I want you to do a study of this word truth in John's Gospel, because both Jesus and John use the word truth to talk about fulfillment. They're both talking about the fact that the new covenant age has dawned. For example, we read in John chapter 4, Jesus is talking to this woman at the well of Sychar. She's had 4 husbands. The man with whom she's living is not her husband. And Jesus says to her, "Go call your husband." And then he says, she says to him, "Our fathers worshipped in this mountain," and I think she's trying to get him off track here. "Our fathers worshipped in this mountain, and you say we ought to worship at Jerusalem." Boy, the Jews say that. What do you say? And Jesus said, "Let me tell you the truth. The hour is coming, and now is, when the true worshipers shall worship God neither in this mountain nor yet at Jerusalem." That doesn't mean you can't worship at this mountain or you can't worship at Jerusalem. He means you can't worship exclusively here. You will be able to worship God wherever you are, for God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. Now, of course we have to worship God according to the truth that is revealed to us in Scripture, but I don't think that's what Jesus is saying. I think what Jesus is saying is you are now to worship God not according to type and shadow. You are now to worship God in terms of fulfillment. Again, another example. Jesus said, "I'm the true light." Or John says, "This is the true light." John chapter 5. John chapter 6. "This is the true bread that came down from heaven." Does that mean that the manna that came down from heaven in the desert was not real bread? No. It means that it wasn't the true bread. That is, it was not the fulfillment of the bread that came down from heaven. The manna was a type of our Lord Jesus Christ, and he has now fulfilled that type. So go through the Gospel of John, and you're going to see that this word true is used in that sense throughout. Jesus said, I am the true vine. What does that mean? Who was the typical vine? And the answer is Israel was the typical vine. And now Jesus and all who are in him are the fulfillment of that. This is not replacement theology. This is fulfillment theology. Okay? Everything that can be said about Israel can be said about the church, but in none of what is said about Israel is it true in the same sense that it is true of the true people of God during the New Covenant period. And so the whole point that I'm making here is that John is talking about the era of fulfillment. And the fact that things have now changed so that no longer is the blessing of God going to one nation that has been greatly favored by God, but now the blessings of God are going to the world. For God so loved the world, people of every nation. Now I think another possible meaning for what John is saying here is, and we saw it back in chapter 1, he was in the world was made by him. The world did not recognize him. The world did not know him, did not receive him. It's talking about the ungodly who have set themselves against God and his truth. Again, Jesus says, don't be surprised if the world hates you. Does it mean don't be surprised if every single person on the face of the earth hates you? No. He's saying don't be surprised if those who hate God and have set themselves against God's truth hate you. Because the world hated me before it hated you, and it hates me because it hates the one who sent me. I think one of the things Jesus could be saying here, or John could be saying here, depending on who's speaking, is God loved miserable, fallen, wretched rebels. D.A. Carson makes the comment showing that it is not the number of people that shows how great God's love is, but the nature of people that shows how great God's love for his people is. Said this, it is not how big the world is that shows the greatness of God's love, but how bad the world is that shows the greatness of God's love. I think that's a masterful comment. And so I think what John is saying here is probably, for God loved the world in sending his Son to be lifted up for miserable, fallen, wretched sinners from every nation on the face of the earth. And any and every sinner who believes will certainly be justified freely from all things. Notice what he says in the verse. Notice what he doesn't say in the verse. When we find the word whosoever in the scriptures, and that's an old King James Version word. Some of you may be dedicated to the King James Version. I'm not going to quibble with you about that. If you want to speak in terms of 17th century English, you go right ahead. Thou hast my permission to do that. My wife and I are reading through William Bates' book, The Harmony of the Divine Attributes in the Contrivance. Well, you talk about a title. In the Contrivance and Accomplishment of Redemption. And of course he's using that old language, and we're doing our best to try to modernize the language because it sounds so stilted. But look, if you want to adhere to the Old Covenant, to the Old Testament, to the old King James translation, you just go right ahead. But in John chapter 3, when John writes, "For God loved the world in this way," that is, in the way that Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up. There is nothing in the original text that corresponds to your beloved word, whosoever. Well, God couldn't have elected people for himself, because the scripture says, whosoever, or it says he loved the world. How often have I heard that? But listen, you don't have the word whosoever. And if there is something to correspond to the word whosoever in other biblical text, or whoever in the other biblical text, it is always followed by a verb. It is not a standalone word. It's whosoever will, whosoever calls, whosoever comes, etc. And so it's not talking about everybody. It's talking about whosoever believes. Okay, so it's important that we understand that. In order that the ones believing, that's not everyone. It's everyone who is believing. Now, do we have to import our knowledge of other passages of Scripture into this verse in order to understand it properly? And the answer is no. I read a portion yesterday, and we're going to be talking about this when we talk about the comments that were left after that video. I talked about the sufficiency of the work of Christ, and I read the first 7 articles in the second head of doctrine in the Canons of Dort. Now, let me just say this. If I quote from the Canons of Dort or from the Westminster Confession of Faith, I'm not doing that as my authority. The only authority we have are the Scriptures. I'm doing that for definition to show what Calvinists have historically believed. And so I read the first 7 articles to show something specific about what the Canons of Dort had to say relative to the all-sufficiency of the work of Christ. Now, does that mean that I don't understand the rest of what the second head of doctrine stated? And the answer is no. But I don't have to state everything that I know about a particular passage in order to understand that passage. I don't have to bring other material into John chapter 3:16. My task is to understand what the text is saying. Now, it is the task of the systematic theologian to take what is said in John chapter 3 and verse 16, and in Ephesians 1:4, and in Romans chapter 9, and 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, and other places, and show how those things are not contradictory in nature, but are complementary in nature. And so that's what we're trying to do here. We're trying to show that we don't have to read into John 3:16 the whole idea that world means the world of the elect. Now, do we know who everyone who believes are? Do we know that from other passages, such as John chapter 6, for example? Yes, we do. Do we know who everyone who believes is from John chapter 10 and other passages? Yes. But we don't need to import that into this passage to make it mean what we want it to mean. I think we need to take the verse by itself, exegetically, and then having understood it exegetically, then we try to bring these other passages together in systematic theology to understand how they dovetail. There is no contradiction in Scripture. There are complementary verses. Okay, and so we need to understand that. And that's going to be important as we look at many of these other verses in our study. Well, we've already gone on quite a long time. I'm going to make just another brief video, I think, to deal with an objection that's been raised. And that's going to be, I think, a very brief video. But I'm anxious to hear your comments. If you're finding this helpful, let me know that. If you're not finding it helpful, let me know that. I probably could go ride my horse and have a good time if I don't make videos. So if you're not finding it helpful, I'm getting old, don't have much time left. I want to enjoy it, and I'll go do something else if this isn't profitable to you. If it is, let me know. If it isn't, let me know. And sayonara. Until next time, may the Lord richly bless you.